Big section 3, page 225, people. 1984, Signet Classic.
What page is this, Tigan?
225. He didn't know where he was. You know, I don't know if I ever mentioned that. One of my reading strategies that helps me, I always contract words that need contraction. So, like, if it says do not know, I say he didn't know. It makes me read faster. Because if you notice, when you read, your brain is picking up words like 8 or not 5 to 8 words ahead of what your mouth is doing. So I see those coming, and I purposely contract them to make it speedier. He didn't know where he was. Presumably, he was in the Ministry of Love, but there was no way of making certain. He was in a high-ceiling, windowless cell with walls of glittering white porcelain. Concealed lamps flooded it with cold light, and there was a low, steady humming sound which he supposed had something to do with the air supply. A bench or shelf just wide enough to sit on ran round the wall, broken only by a door, and at the end, opposite the door, a lavatory pan with no wooden seat. There were 4 telescreens, one in each wall. There was a dull aching in his belly. It had been there ever since they had bundled him into the closed van and driven him away. But he was also hungry, with a gnawing, unwholesome kind of hunger. It might be 24 hours since he had eaten. It might be 36. He still didn't know, probably never would know, whether it had been morning or evening when they arrested him. Since he was arrested, he had not been fed. He sat as still as he could on the narrow bench, with his hands crossed on his knees. He had already learned to sit still. Top of 226. If you made unexpected movements, they yelled at you from the telescreen, but the craving for food was growing upon him. What he longed for above all was a piece of bread. He had an idea that there were a few breadcrumbs in his pocket of his overalls. It was even possible, he thought, this because from time to time something seemed to tickle his leg, that there might be a sizable bit of crust there. In the end, the temptation to find out overcame his fear. He slipped his hand into his pocket. "Smith," yelled a voice from the telescreen. 6079 Smith W. Hands out of pockets in cells. He sat still again, his hands crossed on his knee. Before being brought here, he had been taken to another place, which must have been an ordinary prison or a temporary lockup used by the patrols. He didn't know how long he had been there, some hours. At any rate, with no clocks and no daylight, it was hard to gauge the time. It was a noisy, evil-smelling place. They had put him in a cell similar to the one he was in now, but filthier, dirty, and at all times crowded by 10 or 15 people. The majority of them were common criminals, but there were a few political prisoners among them. He had sat silent against the wall, jostled by dirty bodies, too preoccupied by fear and the pain in his belly to take much interest in the surroundings, but still noticing the astonishing difference in demeanor between the party prisoners and the others. The party prisoners were always silent and terrified, but the ordinary criminals seemed to care nothing for anybody. They yelled insults at the guards, fought back fiercely when their belongings were impounded, wrote obscene words on the floor, ate smuggled food which they produced from mysterious hiding places in their clothes, and even shouted down the telescreen when it tried to restore order. On the other hand, some of them seemed to be on good terms with the guards, called them by nicknames, and tried to wheedle cigarettes through the spy hole in the door. The guards, too, treated the common criminals with a certain forbearance, even when they had to handle them roughly. There was much talk about the forced labor camps to which most of the prisoners expected to be sent. It was all right in the camps, he gathered, so long as you had good contacts and knew the ropes. There were bribery, favoritism, and racketeering of every kind. There were homosexuality and prostitution. There was even illicit alcohol distilled from potatoes. The positions of trust were given only to the common criminals, especially the gangsters and the murderers, who formed a sort of aristocracy. All the dirty jobs were done by the politicals. So it's always been rumored that Orwell was closeted most of his life, which I personally, I can empathize, but I can't imagine what that must be like to not be yourself in public. There was a constant come and go of prisoners of every description: drug peddlers, thieves, bandits, black marketeers, drunks, prostitutes. Some of the drunks were so violent that the other prisoners had to combine to suppress them. An enormous wreck of a woman, aged about 60, with a great tumbling breasts and thick coils of white hair which had come down in her struggles, was carried in, kicking and shouting, by 4 guards who had to hold of her, one at each corner. They wrenched off the boots with which she had been trying to kick them and dumped her down across Winston's lap, almost breaking his thigh bones. The woman hoisted herself upright and followed them out with a yell of "Fuck, bastards!" Then, noticing that she was sitting on something uneven, she slid off Winston's knees onto the bench. "Beg pardon, dearie. I wouldn't have sat on you. Only the buggers have put me here. There. They don't know how to treat a lady, do they?" She paused, patted her breast, and belched. Remember what accent this is called? Cockney. "Pardon? I ate myself quite." She leaned forward and vomited copiously on the floor.
Oh, damn.
I want you to all out loud and proud practice, starting at beg your pardon. Practice your Cockney accent. Ready? On the count of 3, 2, 1. Beg pardon, dearie. I wouldn't have sat on you. Only the buggers put me there. They don't know how to treat a lady, do they? Pardon? I ate myself quite. She leant forward and vomited copiously on the floor. "That's better," she said, leaning back with closed eyes. "Never keep it down. That's what I say. Get it up while it's fresh on your stomach, like top of 228. She revived, turned to have another look at Winston, and seemed immediately to take a fancy to him. She put a vast arm around his shoulder and drew him toward her, breathing beer and vomit into his face. "What's your name, dearie?" "Smith." "Smith? That's funny. My name's Smith, too. Why," she added sentimentally, "I might be your mother." She might, thought Winston, be his mother. She was about the right age and physique, and it was probable that people had changed somewhat after 20 years in a forced labor camp. No one else had spoken to him. To a surprising extent, the ordinary criminals ignored the party prisoners, the pollets, they called them, with a sort of uninterested contempt. The party prisoners seemed terrified of speaking to anyone, and above all of speaking to one another. Only once, when 2 party members, both women, were pressed close together on the bench, he overheard amid the din of voices a few hurriedly whispered words, and in particular a reference to something called Room 101, which he did not understand. It might be 2 or 3 hours ago that they had brought him here. The dull pain in his belly never went away, but sometimes it grew better and sometimes worse, and his thoughts expanded or contracted accordingly. When it grew worse, he thought only of the pain itself and of his desire for food. When it grew better, panic took hold of him. There were moments when he foresaw the things that would happen to him with such actuality that his heart galloped and his breath stopped. He felt the smash of truncheons on his elbows and iron-shod boots on his shins. He saw himself groveling on the floor, screaming for mercy through broken teeth. He hardly thought of Julia. He could not fix his mind on her. He loved her and would not betray her, but that was only a fact, known as he knew the rules of arithmetic. He felt no love for her, and he hardly even wondered what was happening to her. He thought oftener of O'Brien with a flickering hope. O'Brien must know that he had been arrested. The Brotherhood, he had said, never tried to save its members, but there was a razor blade. They would send the razor blade if they could. There would be perhaps 5 seconds before the guards could rush into the cell. The blade would bite into him with a sort of burning coldness, and even the fingers that held it would be cut to the bone. Everything came back to this sick body, which shrank trembling from the smallest pain. He was not certain that he would use the razor blade, even if he got the chance. It was more natural to exist from moment to moment, accepting another 10 minutes' life, even with the certainty that there was torture at the end of it. Sometimes he tried to calculate the number of porcelain bricks in the wall of the cell. It should have been easy, but he always lost count at some point or another. More often he wondered where he was and what time of day it was. At one moment he felt certain that it was broad daylight outside, and at the next equally certain it was pitch darkness. In this place he knew instinctively the lights would never be turned out. It was the place with no darkness. He saw now why O'Brien had seemed to recognize the illusion. In the Ministry of Love, there were no windows. His cell might be at the heart of the building or against its outer wall. It might be 10 floors below ground or 30 above it. He moved himself mentally from place to place and tried to determine by the feeling of his body whether he was perched high in the air or buried deep underground. There was no sound of marching boots outside. The steel door opened with a clang. A young officer, a trim black uniform figure who seemed to glitter all over with polished leather and whose pale, straight-featured face was like a wax mask, stepped smartly through the doorway. He motioned to the guards outside to bring in the prisoner they were leading. Top of 2:30. The poet Ampleforth shambled into the room. The door clanged shut again. Ampleforth made one of two uncertain movements from side to side as though having some idea that there was another door to get out of, and then began to wander up and down the cell. He had not yet noticed Winston's presence. His troubled eyes were gazing at the wall about a meter above the level of Winston's head. He was shoeless, large, dirty toes were sticking out of his holes of his socks. He was also several days away from a shave. A scrubby beard covered his face to the cheekbones, giving him an air of a ruffianism that went oddly with his large, weak frame and nervous movements. Winston roused himself a little from his lethargy. He must speak to Ampleforth and risk the yell from the telescreen. It was even conceivable that Ampleforth was the bearer of the razor blade. Ampleforth! There was no yell from the telescreen. Ampleforth paused, mildly startled. His eyes focused themselves slowly on Winston. "Ah, Smith, you too? What are you in for?" "To tell you the truth," he sat down awkwardly on the bench opposite Winston, "there is only one offense, is there not? And have you committed it?" "Apparently I have." He put his hand to his forehead and pressed his temples for a moment, as though trying to remember something. "These things happen," he began vaguely. "I have been able to recall one instance, a possible instance. It was an indiscretion, undoubtedly. We were producing a definitive edition of the poems of Kipling. I allowed the word God to remain at the end of a line. I could not help it," he added almost indignantly, raising his face to look at Winston. "It was impossible to change the line. The rhyme was rod. Do you realize that there are only 12 rhymes to rod in the entire language? For days I had racked my brain. There was no other rhyme." The expression on his face changed. The annoyance passed out of it, and for a moment he looked almost pleased, a sort of intellectual warmth, the joy of the pedant who has found out some useless fact shone through the dirt and scrubby hair. "Has it ever occurred to you that the whole history of English poetry has been determined by the fact that English language lacks rhymes?" No, that particular thought had never occurred to Winston. I wonder if that's true. English language does what? No, it doesn't. I don't. English is English. I don't get it. Maybe they're the new English, new speak English.
I mean, they do remove a lot of words and remake them, so it would make sense if there's not a lot of things that properly rhyme. That would make sense.
Yeah, there's only 12 rhymes of odd. The sound odd. I could think of 13 right now. No, that particular thought never occurred to Winston, nor in the circumstances did it strike him as very important or interesting. "Do you know what time of day it is?" Ampleforth looked startled again. "I had hardly thought about it. They arrested me. It could be 2 days ago, perhaps 3. His eyes flitted around the walls as though he half expected to find a window somewhere. "There's no difference between night and day in this place. I do not see how one can calculate the time." They talked desultorily. Desultorily. Write that down. Write it 10 times. Spelling test on Friday.
What? Tigan,
Write the definition 10 times too.
I'm going to rip your stapler to pieces.
They talked desultorily for some minutes. Then, it's probably whispering. Then, without apparent reason, a yell from the telescreen bade them be silent. Winston sat quietly, his hands crossed, Ampleforth too large to sit in comfort on the narrow bench, fidgeted from side to side, clasping his lank hands first round one knee, then round the other. The telescreen barked at him to keep still. Time passed, 20 minutes, an hour. It was difficult to judge. Once more, there was a sound of boots outside. Winston's entrails contracted. Soon, very soon, perhaps in 5 minutes, perhaps now, the tramp of boots would mean that his own turn had come. Top of 232. The door opened. The cold-faced young officer stepped into the cell. With a brief moment of the hand, he indicated Ampleforth. Room 101. Ampleforth marched clumsily out between the guards, his face vaguely perturbed, but uncomprehending. What seemed like a long time passed. The pain in Winston's belly had revived. His mind sagged round and round on the same track, like a ball falling again and again into the same series of slots. He'd only 6 thoughts. The pain in his belly, a piece of bread, the blood and the screaming, O'Brien, Julia, the razor blade. I'm gonna mark those. Only 6 thoughts. I think I'd be having more than 6 thoughts, but maybe not. There was another spasm in his entrails. That's his gut and his intestines and his colon entrails. Or like when you disembowel someone in Game of Thrones, entrails. The heavy boots were approaching. As the door opened, the wave of air that it created brought in a powerful smell of cold sweat. Parsons walked into the cell. He was wearing khaki, the neighbor. He was wearing khaki shorts and a sports shirt. This time Winston was startled into self-forgetfulness. You, here, he said. Parsons gave Winston a glance in which there was neither interest or surprise, but only misery. He began walking jerkily up and down, evidently unable to keep still. Each time he straightened his pudgy knees, it was apparent that they were trembling. His eyes had a wide-open, staring look, as though he could not prevent himself from gazing at something in the middle distance. "What are you in for?" said Winston. "Thought crime," said Parsons, almost blubbering. The tone of his voice implied at once a complete admission of his guilt and a sort of incredulous horror that such a word could be applied to himself. He paused opposite Winston and began eagerly appealing to him. "You don't think they'll shoot me, do you, old chap? They don't shoot you if you haven't actually done anything, only thoughts, which you can't help. I know. They give you a fair hearing. Oh, I trust them for that. They'll know my record, 233, won't they? You know what kind of chap I am." Chap is like dude. Not a bad chap in my way. Not brainy, of course, but keen. I tried to do my best for the party, didn't I? I'll get off with 5 years, don't you think? Or even 10? A chap like me could make himself pretty useful in a labor camp. They wouldn't shoot me for going off the rails just once. "Are you guilty?" "Of course I'm guilty," cried Parsons with a servile glance at the telescreen. "You don't think the party would arrest an innocent man, do you?" His frog-like face grew calmer and even took on a slightly sanctimonious expression. "Thought crime is a dreadful thing, old man," he said sententiously. "It's insidious. It can get hold of you without even knowing it. Do you know how it got hold of me? In my sleep. Yes, that's a fact. There I was, working away, trying to do my bit. Never knew I had any bad stuff in my mind at all. And then I started talking in my sleep. Do you know what they heard me saying?" He sank his voice like someone who obliged for medical reasons to utter an obscenity. "Down with Big Brother. Yes, I said that. Said it over and over again, it seems. Between you and me, old man, I'm glad they got me before it went any further. Do you know what I'm going to say to them when I go up before the tribunal?" Court. "Thank you, I'm going to say. Thank you for saving me before it was too late." "Who denounced you?" "It was my little daughter," said Parsons with a sort of doleful pride. "She listened to the keyhole, heard what I was saying, and nipped off to the patrols the very next day. Pretty smart for a nip of 7, eh? I don't bear her any grudge for it. In fact, I'm proud of her. It shows I brought her up in the right spirit, anyway." He made a few more jerky movements up and down, several times.
Remember when he wrote it in his journal?
And that was the dad who was bragging about her
his kid getting to beat his daughter, getting to be just like about police, which is definitely something you want your child to grow up to be.
What
And
page?
not horrified though.
We have a connection to
18.
we have a connection to the
Page 18.
journal. Connection to the journal that he wrote in the very beginning of the book.
When he was still living in his, because he is still living in his house. Because those are his neighbors.
Good job remembering that.
Yeah.
Good job
John
marking
and
it.
I looked at each other and we're like,
Now who's saying that he's putting that in his journal, correct? So they might have found the journal. We don't know that.
I feel like they just got him at that place. They're gonna search his house.
Big foreshadow, page 18. So Winston, that's probably making Winston think about that a little harder. Then he said, several times casting at the top of 34, longing glance at the lavatory pan. Then he suddenly ripped down his shorts. "Excuse me, old man. I can't help it. It's the waiting." He plumped his large posterior onto the lavatory pan. Winston covered his face with his hands. There's really no great stopping point here. "Smith!" yelled the voice from the telescreen. 6079 Smith, W, uncover your face. No faces covered in the cells. Winston uncovered his face. Parsons used the lavatory loudly and abundantly. It then turned out that the plug was defective, and the cell stank abominably for hours afterwards.